My name is Chloe Evans. I'm 35 and I live in Denver, Colorado. I'm the founder of a renewable energy company that I built from the ground up. But to my family, I was always the one who would never amount to anything. They just never truly saw me. 2 weeks ago, my mother called. Her timing, as always, was impeccable. "Chloe," Eleanor said. Her voice as crisp and cool over the phone as it always was right before she passed a sentence. "We don't believe you're ready to join us for Christmas dinner this year, not with the kind of guests we're having." My father didn't even try to soften the blow. He got on the line and added, his tone dripping with dismissal, "Focus on proving yourself first, Chloe." I hung up, a familiar tightness clenching my chest, and I made a decision in that very moment. I would never again beg for a seat at their table. I stayed home. While they were raising champagne glasses with their high society friends, I was hunched over my desk, finalizing a proposal that had the power to change absolutely everything. Later that night, I flipped on the TV for some background noise, and suddenly, there it was. My company's logo, NovaGen Energy, splashed across the screen. My deal had just shattered industry records, a $175 million contract that was making national headlines. I just sat there, alone in my quiet office, watching my own name light up the screen, a silent, definitive rebuttal to their lifelong doubts. The next morning, my phone was a constant buzzing storm of notifications. And guess who was waiting in my office lobby? My parents and my sister, all smiles, acting as if they had been my biggest cheerleaders all along. But I had learned something far more valuable than their conditional approval could ever be. Want to know how I transformed their rejection into my greatest victory? Stick around, because this story is just getting started. If you've ever felt like you weren't good enough for the people who were supposed to believe in you the most, drop your story in the comments. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss what happens next. Growing up in the Evans household was a constant lesson in living up to other people's expectations, never my own. My father, Robert Evans, was a top corporate litigator in Denver, a man who commanded boardrooms and family dinners with the same unyielding authority. My mother, Eleanor Evans, was a celebrated political columnist whose opinions were quoted in national publications and treated as undeniable facts at home. My older brother, Leo Evans, was their masterpiece, the Golden Boy, a brilliant neurosurgeon whose face was already appearing in hospital advertisements before he even hit 30. And my younger sister, Sophia Evans, was hot on his heels. She was a Wall Street analyst closing multi-million-dollar deals before she was legally old enough to order a celebratory drink. And then there was me, Chloe. The odd one out, the one scribbling designs for solar panels in a battered notebook while they debated hostile takeovers and medical ethics. Our family's Sunday dinner table was less a place for connection and more a courtroom where my siblings presented their latest triumphs and I was cross-examined for my apparent failures. Every week, we'd gather in the formal dining room, the crystal glasses gleaming, and I'd feel myself shrink, becoming more and more invisible with each passing minute. "Chloe, why can't you be more like Leo?" my father would ask, not even bothering to look up from the steak he was meticulously carving. My mother would give a slight, affirming nod, adding, "Sophia is already presenting to investment committees. What exactly are you doing with those little science projects of yours?" My ideas about sustainable energy were treated like childish hobbies, cute but ultimately pointless fantasies. "It's not a real career, Chloe," Sophia once scoffed, rolling her eyes as she glanced at a stock ticker on her phone. Leo rarely even bothered to engage, usually too preoccupied with recounting a complex surgery or a new medical breakthrough he was pioneering. I would just bite my tongue, my gaze fixed on my plate, a burning knot of frustration tightening in my stomach. I knew they would never understand. Those dinners were meant to shape me into one of them, but they had the opposite effect. I would retreat to my room, the sound of their voices fading, and lose myself in sketches of cleaner, more efficient energy systems, dreaming of a world that didn't run on their brand of validation. They saw my passion as a rebellious phase, something I'd eventually outgrow once I got serious about my future. I was 16 when my mother placed a brochure for a prestigious law school on my desk. "This," she said, tapping the glossy cover, "is what success looks like." The moment she left the room, I ripped it into tiny pieces. My defiance was quiet but resolute, fueled by their endless comparisons and casual dismissals. They honestly believed they were pushing me toward greatness, but all they were really teaching me was that I would never, ever fit into their world. The only person in my orbit who truly saw me was my grandfather, Arthur Vance. He was my mother's father, but he was nothing like the rest of them. A retired civil engineer, he had built his own small but successful firm from the ground up, and he understood the language of blueprints and dreams. He'd sit with me on his porch for hours, listening patiently as I explained my latest ideas about photovoltaic cells and energy grids. "You've got something really special in that head of yours, Chloe," he'd say, his voice a steady rumble, his eyes crinkling with a genuine belief that I never saw in my parents. "Don't you ever let them dim your light." When I turned 17, he gave me a worn, dog-eared textbook on renewable energy, its margins filled with his own notes and calculations. "This world needs more people like you, kiddo," he told me, pressing the heavy book into my hands. It was the first time I felt like my passion wasn't a flaw, but a strength. But Arthur's support was a small shield against a constant barrage. At 18, during a particularly brutal Sunday dinner, my father laid into me about my unrealistic life goals. "You are wasting your God-given potential," he said, his voice laced with a disappointment that cut deeper than anger. Sophia, ever the opportunist, chimed in. "Maybe if you tried a little harder to be practical, you'd actually matter to someone." That was it. I pushed my chair back, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and walked out of the dining room. My mother didn't call after me. Leo didn't even look up from his phone. That night, I sat in my room clutching the book Arthur had given me and made a silent promise to myself. I would prove them wrong, not for their sake, but for my own. College wasn't much of an escape. My professors at the University of Colorado Boulder were intrigued by my ideas, but my grades often suffered because I spent every spare moment in the engineering library devouring research papers on solar technology that went far beyond the curriculum. My classmates nicknamed me the Dreamer, a label that was half mocking, half pitying. I didn't care. I was building something bigger than their opinions, something that I believed could genuinely change the way we power our lives. But every trip home was a reminder of the suffocating weight of my family's judgment. "You're just not cut out for this, Chloe," my mother said once, her tone final, as if she had already written the conclusion to my life story. I stopped sharing my dreams with them after that. By the time I hit 19, I was drowning in their expectations. The Evans family wanted a litigator, a surgeon, a financier, not a kid obsessed with saving the planet. Arthur was the only anchor I had. "They don't get to define you," he said one quiet afternoon as we sat on his porch swing, his hands rough and calloused from a lifetime of work resting on his knees. He told me stories of his own early struggles, of how he ignored the naysayers and doubters to build his company. "You'll find your people," he promised me, "the ones who speak your language." I clung to that promise, even as my family's voices echoed in my head, a constant chorus telling me I'd never be enough. My sophomore year of college, I made the single most terrifying and liberating decision of my life. I was 20, enrolled in the engineering program at CU Boulder, but my real education wasn't happening in lecture halls. I spent every waking moment not dedicated to my part-time job, sketching designs for high-efficiency solar panels, absolutely convinced that I was on the verge of a breakthrough. My dorm room looked more like a mad scientist's lab than a student's living space, covered in notebooks, with complex calculations scrawled on takeout napkins and stacks of articles on renewable energy. I wasn't chasing a degree anymore. I was chasing a vision. And that vision had no place in the Evans family master plan. So one crisp spring afternoon, I walked into the registrar's office and officially withdrew from the university. The explosion at home was immediate and catastrophic. My father summoned me to the living room, his face a mask of crimson fury. "You are throwing your life away on some ridiculous pipe dream," he yelled, slamming his coffee mug down on the glass table with a crack. My mother stood beside him, arms crossed, her expression one of cold, profound disappointment. "This is beyond reckless, Chloe," she said. "Do you really think you're smarter than all of us?" Leo, who was visiting for the weekend from his prestigious hospital, just shook his head with a condescending smirk. "Good luck with that," he muttered, as if I were a charity case he was already tired of. Sophia was, predictably, the most brutal. "You're embarrassing us," she snapped, her voice dripping with a disdain that stung more than my father's anger. They didn't just disapprove, they issued an ultimatum. They cut me off completely. No more tuition, no allowance, no safety net. I was entirely on my own. I packed one suitcase, took the small amount of money I had in my savings account, and moved into a cramped studio apartment on the outskirts of Denver, the kind with peeling paint, a perpetually leaky faucet, and the lingering smell of other people's failed dreams. I was terrified. But then, my grandfather, Arthur Vance, called me. He was in the hospital by then, his voice frail and weakened by illness, but his words were as solid as steel. "I believe in you, Chloe," he said, and I could hear the unwavering conviction in his voice. A few days later, a check for $12,000 arrived in the mail, his entire life savings. Tucked inside the envelope was a handwritten note in a shaky scrawl, "Go build something real." It was the last time I ever heard from him. He passed away a month later, and I carried his final words and his faith like a sacred torch. With Arthur's money, I bought a used, high-powered laptop, some specialized engineering software, and a small mountain of textbooks on solar technology. I officially named my fledgling project NovaGen Energy, a tribute to the new generation of power I was determined to create. But Denver wasn't a startup haven back then, and I was a nobody, a 20-year-old college dropout with a wild idea and no connections. To survive, I started working nights as a barista at a 24-hour coffee shop, pouring coffee for weary travelers and counting my meager tips to buy groceries. My days were spent at the public library teaching myself advanced circuit design and energy storage principles. I would sketch prototypes on coffee-stained napkins. Between rushes at work, my hands a permanent mix of ink and the smell of espresso. The loneliness was a physical weight. My old classmates were posting photos of their internships at major tech companies and their fraternity parties, while I was microwaving instant noodles in a tiny room that always smelled faintly of mildew. I'd lie awake at night staring at the water-stained ceiling, wondering if my father was right, if I was just chasing an impossible fantasy. But then I'd open the worn textbook Arthur had given me and reread the note he'd written on the inside cover, "Keep going." That was usually enough to silence the doubts, at least for a little while. I started forcing myself to go to local tech and engineering meetups, pitching my idea in dingy community center basements to anyone who would listen. Most of them, older men in the industry, dismissed me with a polite, patronizing smile. "Solar's a long shot, kid," one of them told me, patting my shoulder. "Stick to something more practical." But I kept talking, kept refining my pitch, kept improving my designs. I learned to develop a thick skin, to focus on the math and the physics, not the rejections. My very first prototype was a complete and total failure. Wires fried, panels cracked, and it produced barely enough energy to power a light bulb. But it was mine. Every single failure was a data point, teaching me something new, and with each one, I felt myself getting closer. Months bled into a full year. I was 21, perpetually broke and bone-tired, but NovaGen Energy was starting to take a recognizable shape. I had a functional model, a clunky, oversized contraption that only generated a fraction of the power I was aiming for, but it was tangible proof that I wasn't completely crazy. I launched a simple website posting my designs and openly begging for feedback from the online engineering community. A few generous souls responded, offering advice and technical tips. One engineer from Oregon even mailed me a spare, high-capacity battery to use for testing. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I was building my dream piece by painful piece, with no one but the memory of my grandfather cheering me on. The Evans family never called. Not once. I'd see Sophia's name mentioned in the business section of the paper, or a new billboard for Leo's neurosurgery practice go up downtown. My mother's columns were syndicated everywhere, and my father's legal cases often made the evening news. They were all soaring while I was just scraping by. But I didn't want their life. I wanted my own. NovaGen was my rebellion. It was my way of declaring that I didn't need their permission or their approval to matter. I just needed to keep pushing, one long, lonely night at a time. One late night in that same 24-hour coffee shop, my world shifted. I was 23, hunched over my laptop in a corner booth, surrounded by a fortress of empty coffee cups and crumpled napkins covered in circuit diagrams. NovaGen was still mostly a dream, embodied by a slightly less clunky prototype that only occasionally short-circuited. I was still pitching my idea to anyone who would listen, but most people's eyes glazed over the moment I started talking about photovoltaic efficiency. Then this lanky guy with thick glasses and a worn-out flannel shirt slid into the seat across from me. "You're the solar panel girl, right?" he asked. His voice was curious, not mocking. That was a first. His name was Ben Carter. He was an energy engineer recently laid off from a failed green tech startup, and he actually understood what I was trying to do. He saw something in my messy designs that no one else had. "This could actually work," he said, pointing a finger at a specific equation on my screen. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't screaming into a void. We started working together, spending our nights in a rented, unheated garage we optimistically called our lab. Ben brought the practical, hands-on technical expertise I was missing. I brought the relentless, obsessive drive. Together, we began to refine the solar panel design, aiming for an efficiency rating that the big players in the industry hadn't managed to crack yet. 6 months in, we had a polished pitch deck and a prototype that, most importantly, didn't catch fire. That felt like progress. Ben suggested it was time to look for investors. I was deeply skeptical. Denver wasn't Silicon Valley, and we were two nobodies with an idea. But Ben knew someone who knew someone. Isabel Reed, a partner at a small venture capital firm called Blue Horizon Ventures. We managed to secure a meeting. I spent 3 sleepless days practicing my pitch, my voice shaking as I rehearsed in front of the bathroom mirror, trying to sound like a CEO. Isabel was sharp, intimidating, and no nonsense. She peppered us with questions that cut straight to the financial viability and market potential. At the end of our presentation, she leaned back in her chair, studying me for a long, silent moment. "You've got guts," she said finally. "I'm in for $60,000. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to officially incorporate NovaGen Energy. With Isabel's seed money, we moved out of the garage and into a small, windowless office. We bought better equipment and hired a couple of part-time coders. Ben and I poured every ounce of our energy into landing our first major project, installing a custom solar panel system for a local craft brewery. We worked 18-hour days, troubleshooting code, wiring panels, tweaking algorithms, and obsessively testing the energy output. I barely slept, surviving on a diet of cheap energy drinks and the sheer thrill of being so close to building something real. Ben was the one who kept me sane, cracking terrible jokes whenever he saw the stress getting to me. "We're not curing cancer, Chloe," he'd say with a grin, "but we're damn close to powering a place that makes beer, which is almost as important." Isabel checked in with us monthly, her calls always brief and to the point, pushing us to hit our milestones. I finally felt like I was building something that mattered. And then it all fell apart. The brewery installation was our big showcase, and we botched it horribly. The panels overheated in the summer sun, frying the circuits in less than a week. The client, furious, pulled out of the contract, and we lost half of our initial funding in penalties. I sat in our empty office staring at the charred remains of our first commercial prototype, a sick, heavy knot twisting in my stomach. "We're done," I told Ben, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. I'd sunk Arthur's legacy, my own savings, and 3 years of my life into this, and all I had to show for it was a pile of ash. I could hear my father's voice in my head. "You're throwing your life away." For the first time, I thought maybe he was right. Ben wouldn't let me spiral. "Failures are just data," he said, tossing a burnt wire into the trash. "We know what's wrong now, so we fix it." I wanted to quit, to just walk away and get a normal job, but his stubborn, infuriating optimism was contagious. We went back to the drawing board. Ben dug deep into the technical flaws, identifying faulty heat sinks and inadequate voltage regulators. I buried myself in the math, recalculating energy yields and thermal dynamics. Isabel didn't pull her remaining funding, but her calls became colder, her emails shorter. The message was clear. We couldn't afford another mistake. I started spending hours on online engineering forums, swallowing my pride and begging for advice from experts across the country. One engineer in Portland sent us a research paper on a new generation of photovoltaic cells. It was a long shot, but it sparked an idea. We decided to pivot, redesigning our entire panel around a new system for thermal management and higher energy conversion. It meant scrapping months of work, but Ben was all in. "This is the one," he said, his eyes bright as he sketched the new layout on our whiteboard. The pivot was brutal. We were broke again, to the point where we had to give up our apartments and share a cheap one-bedroom to cut costs. I took on freelance coding gigs at night just to keep the lights on, while Ben scavenged for parts from scrapped electronics at recycling centers. We tested the new design relentlessly in our garage, running simulations until our laptops overheated. And then, slowly, it started to work. The new panels were hitting 20% efficiency, significantly better than the industry standard. We weren't out of the woods, but for the first time in months, we had a fighting chance. Ben and I had become a real team, more than just coworkers. He didn't care about my family's pedigree or my lack of a college degree. He just believed in Novagen, and that belief kept me going on the days I wanted to give up. We were building something bigger than ourselves, one catastrophic failure at a time. 3 years later, Novagen Energy was finally showing real signs of life. I was no longer the broke, 20-something dropout barely scraping by. Ben and I had transformed our little office into a bustling workspace with a team of 6, including 2 full-time coders and a part-time designer. Our redesigned solar panels were now hitting an incredible 22% efficiency, outperforming most of our established competitors. We landed our first real substantial contract, a $200,000 deal to install panels for a local brewery in Denver, a different, braver one. It wasn't millions, but it was concrete proof that we could deliver on our promises. Soon after, 2 more local businesses signed on, a community center and a small manufacturing plant. Word began to spread, and a few industry blogs started mentioning Novagen, a promising startup to watch, one headline read. I printed out that article and taped it to the wall above my desk, a small but powerful reminder that we were finally getting somewhere. Isabel, our investor, was pleased, but as always, relentless. "You're on the radar now, Chloe," she told me during one of our calls, her voice all business. "Don't get comfortable." She pushed us to scale up, to start pitching bigger clients. Ben and I spent weeks crafting proposals, targeting regional energy firms and corporations. I felt more alive than I had in years, like every sleepless night and every sacrifice was finally starting to pay off. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself a flicker of hope that my family might see me differently. The holidays were approaching, and I started to picture myself walking into their annual Christmas dinner, head held high, ready to share news of Novagen's wins. Maybe my father would offer a respectful nod. Maybe my mother would ask a genuine question about my work. Maybe Leo and Sophia would finally stop looking at me like I was a lost cause. I called home in early December, my stomach fluttering with a nervous optimism I hadn't felt in years, hoping to confirm my place at the Christmas dinner. My mother answered, her tone immediately clipped and distant. "Chloe, we're hosting some very important guests this year," she said. I asked who. "Senators, CEOs, people who have actually made something of themselves," she stated, the implication hanging in the air. "You're just not ready to sit with them." I gripped the phone, stunned into silence. "What do you mean, not ready?" I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. My father took the phone. "Your little project isn't there yet," he said, his voice cold and final. "Come back when you have something real to show for yourself." I tried to argue, to tell them about the brewery contract, the new hires, the blog articles, but my mother cut me off. "We'll see you when you're on their level," she said, and the line went dead. I stood in my office staring at the silent phone, the familiar tightness squeezing my chest. I sent a quick text to Sophia, who replied with a single cutting line: "Focus on catching up." Their words burned, a fresh wound layered over years of old scars, echoing every dismissive glance and condescending comment from those Sunday dinners. I wasn't invited to my own family's table because my life's work wasn't real enough for their elite circle. I could have begged. I could have shown up anyway and forced a confrontation, but I was done pleading for their approval. I turned off my phone and went back to my desk. That night, I channeled all my hurt and anger into a new proposal for Apex Grid, a major energy conglomerate based in Colorado. Their director of innovation, Maria Flores, had reached out after reading about our brewery project, intrigued by our high-efficiency panels. Ben was skeptical. They were a giant, and we were barely a blip on the radar. But I saw a chance to prove myself, not to my family, but to the world. I threw myself into the work, rerunning numbers to show how our panels could cut their operational costs by a staggering 30%. Ben handled the complex technical specifications, staying up all night with me to refine every single detail. Isabel gave us feedback, warning us that Apex played hardball. "They will chew you up and spit you out if you're not perfect," she cautioned. The days leading up to Christmas blurred into a sleepless haze. While Denver lit up with festive decorations, I was glued to my laptop, tweaking presentation slides and running simulations until the letters on the screen swam before my eyes. Ben brought takeout to the office, joking about our festive diet of cold pizza and stale coffee. I barely noticed the season. My family's rejection was a constant burning fuel, but so was the brewery's glowing 5-star review of our new panels. We were so close to something massive, I could feel it in my bones. On December 23rd, I sent the draft proposal to Maria Flores at Apex. She replied within hours, requesting a meeting on Christmas Eve. "Impressive work," she wrote. "Let's see if you can deliver under pressure." I didn't tell my family about Apex. They didn't deserve to know. While they were preparing for their high society dinner party, I was preparing to pitch the biggest deal of my life. Ben and I rehearsed until our voices were raw, testing every slide, anticipating every possible question. I wasn't just fighting for Novagen anymore. I was fighting for all the years I'd been called a dreamer, a disappointment, a failure. Maria's email was pinned to the top of my inbox, a beacon of hope pulling me forward. Christmas was 2 days away, and I was ready to bet everything I had on that meeting, even if it meant spending the holiday completely alone. On Christmas Day, I sat alone in front of my television. The office was eerily quiet. The only sounds the low hum of my laptop and the flickering light of the screen in our cramped Denver workspace. While my family was surely toasting with their VIP guests, I was deep in spreadsheets, finalizing the last details of the Apex Grid proposal. Ben had reluctantly gone home to be with his parents, but I couldn't pull myself away. This deal was my one shot to prove that I was more than their unready daughter. I'd been up since dawn, triple checking every slide, every calculation, every projection. Our panels could save Apex 30% on their energy costs, but I knew they demanded absolute perfection, and I was determined to deliver it. At 2 p.m., an email from Maria Flores hit my inbox. "Solid proposal," she wrote, "but your heat dissipation system needs to be stronger for our desert installations. Can you fix it by tonight?" My heart sank. The heat issue was our old nemesis, the very thing that had tanked our first project years ago. I immediately called Ben, who was halfway through his mother's famous pecan pie. "We've got 6 hours," I said, my voice tight with urgency. He didn't hesitate. "I'm on my way." By 3 p.m., he was back in the office, a large coffee in hand, already diving into the technical specs. We tore apart the design, focusing entirely on the cooling system. I ran simulation after simulation while he reworked the schematics, our 2 screens glowing brightly in the otherwise dark and empty office. The hours blurred into an intense, focused rush. I scribbled complex thermal equations on the whiteboard, my hands shaking from a combination of caffeine and adrenaline. Ben found a critical flaw in the ventilation design and proposed using a new experimental alloy for the heat sinks. "This could push the efficiency to 25%, he said, his eyes bright with that same spark of discovery I saw the night we met. I recalculated the energy output, plugging his changes into my models. The numbers looked good, better than good. By 8 p.m., we had a completely new design, lighter, cooler, and more efficient than anything we had ever built before. I typed up the revisions, my fingers flying across the keyboard, and sent the updated proposal to Maria at exactly 9:47 p.m. "Here's the fix," I wrote, hitting send with a knot of pure anxiety in my stomach. I collapsed onto the worn-out couch in the corner of the office, too wired to even think about going home. The TV was on, tuned to some local news channel droning on about holiday travel delays. Then at 10:15 p.m., my phone pinged. Maria's name flashed on the screen. I held my breath as I opened the email. "Your solution checks out," it read. "We are signing the contract. $175 million for NovaGen Energy to supply panels for our entire Midwest grid. Congratulations." I stared at the words, my breath catching in my throat. $175 million. It wasn't just a deal, it was a revolution. I called Ben, who let out a whoop so loud I had to pull the phone away from my ear. "We did it, Chloe," he shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. I started laughing, a strange choked sound as tears of relief stung my eyes. I could feel my grandfather Arthur's belief in me, a warm presence spanning the years. Before I could even begin to process the magnitude of it all, the TV screen behind me shifted. "Breaking news," the anchor said, her voice sharp and urgent. Denver-based startup NovaGen Energy has just secured a landmark $175 million contract with Apex Grid, marking a new record in the renewable energy sector. My name flashed on the screen. Chloe Evans, co-founder of NovaGen Energy. They were calling us industry pioneers. Our panels a quantum leap forward in green technology. I sat there, frozen, watching my own face on the news. My company's logo displayed proudly next to the Apex Grid behemoth. The brewery contract, the late nights, the failures, the desperate pitches. It had all led to this single, brilliant moment. I had done the very thing my family had insisted I couldn't. I thought of my father's cutting words, "Come back when you've got something real." My mother's dismissal, "You're not ready." This was real. This was me, proving them wrong on a stage so large they couldn't possibly ignore it. I didn't call them. I didn't feel the need to. The world knew about NovaGen now, and for the first time, that felt like enough. I texted Ben. "We're on the map." He replied with a single emoji, a rocket ship. My investor, Isabel, called minutes later, her usual cool, measured tone replaced with unbridled excitement. "You've just shaken up the entire industry," she said. "Get ready for what comes next." I stayed in the office late into the night, replaying the news clip over and over, letting the weight and wonder of it all sink in. The contract wasn't just about the money. It was validation. Every doubt, every rejection, every long night I'd spent questioning myself, it all just faded away. I wasn't the dreamer they had laughed off at the dinner table. I was Chloe Evans, and Novagen Energy was rewriting the rules. As the clock ticked past midnight, I finally shut off the TV, my mind already racing, planning what we would build next. The world was watching, and I was just getting started. The morning after Christmas, my phone was in a state of meltdown. By 8 a.m., my inbox was overflowing with messages from national reporters, industry blogs, and even a few congratulatory notes from competitors. Novagen's $175 million deal with Apex Grid was the biggest story in the business world, and our little Denver startup was at the center of it all. Social media was buzzing with our name, and a local radio station was calling us Colorado's green tech miracle. I was still in the office, running on pure adrenaline and what was left of yesterday's cold coffee, when Ben burst in, grinning from ear to ear. "We're trending," he announced, holding up his phone to show me. I laughed, a real, genuine laugh. But my mind was already churning through the next steps: scaling production, hiring more engineers, and most importantly, keeping Apex happy. Then my receptionist buzzed my desk phone. "Chloe." "Your family is here," she said, her voice hesitant. I froze. My father, mother, and Sophia were standing in our lobby dressed in their finest, looking like they were on their way to a charity gala. No Leo, of course. He was probably too busy being featured on another hospital billboard. I walked out to meet them, my stomach twisting into a tight, cold knot. My father extended his hand, a broad, unfamiliar smile plastered on his face. "Chloe, we saw the news," he boomed. What a tremendous achievement. My mother nodded, her expression softer and prouder than I had ever seen it. "We're so proud of you, darling," she added, her voice dripping with a sincerity that felt utterly counterfeit. Sophia, dressed in a sharply tailored blazer, chimed in. "This is huge, Chloe. Really." I just stood there, silent, waiting for the other shoe to drop. It didn't take long. Sophia leaned in closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "I know some major investors who would be dying to meet you," she said, her eyes glinting with opportunity. "I could set up some introductions, for Novagen's sake, of course." And there it was. They weren't here for me. They were here for the success, for the reflected glory, for a piece of the action. I clenched my fists at my sides, a decade of dismissal and condescension flashing through my mind. The lonely dinners where they'd ignored me, the years they'd called my dreams childish and foolish, the Christmas they had literally shut me out. I wasn't their little girl anymore, begging for a scrap of approval at their table. "You're proud now?" I asked, my voice steady but cold as ice. My father raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting any resistance. "When I was pouring coffee at 3 a.m. just to pay my rent, where were you?" I turned to my mother. "When I dropped out of college to chase this pipe dream, you said I was reckless." Sophia opened her mouth to protest, but I cut her off. "And you," I said, looking directly at my sister, "you told me I'd never matter. Now you want to play matchmaker with your powerful investor friends?" The lobby fell silent. Ben, who had been standing near the doorway, gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. He knew this was coming. My father attempted to smooth things over. "Chloe, we just want to support you now," he said, his tone patronizing, as if he were speaking to a temperamental teenager. I just shook my head. "You didn't believe in me when it was hard. You don't get to claim this victory now that it's easy." My mother's face tightened. "We are your family," she said, as if those 4 words could erase everything. I took a step closer, my voice low and firm. Family doesn't tell you that you're not enough. Family doesn't cut you off when you're struggling to build something from nothing. Sophia scoffed, crossing her arms defensively. "Oh, you're being dramatic," she said. "We're here now, aren't we?" I looked at them then, really looked at them. My father in his polished suit, my mother with her perfect posture, my sister with her calculated, ambitious smile. They hadn't changed at all. They had just seen Novagen's name in lights and thought they could waltz in, rewrite the entire story, and act like they had been on my side all along. "You're here because the news told you to be," I said quietly. "I built this without you. I don't need your connections, and I certainly don't need your approval." The words felt like a physical weight lifting off my shoulders. For the very first time in my life, I didn't care what they thought of me. My father's face reddened with anger. "You're making a mistake, Chloe," he warned. "You'll need us someday." I almost laughed. "I needed you 10 years ago," I replied. "I don't anymore." My mother reached out, her voice softening into a plea. "Let's just talk this over at lunch," she said, gesturing toward the door. "We can celebrate properly." I shook my head. "I have work to do," I said, turning my back on them and walking toward my office. "You know the way out." I heard Sophia mutter something under her breath as they left, but I didn't catch it. I didn't care to. As the lobby doors closed behind them, Ben walked over, holding 2 fresh cups of coffee. "That was badass," he said, handing me one. I managed a smile, though my heart was still pounding. Walking away from them felt final, like closing a heavy door that I had foolishly left cracked open for far too long. I sat down at my desk, the glowing Apex Grid contract on my screen. Novagen wasn't just a company. It was mine, built from my failures, my late nights, and my defiance. I didn't need their celebratory lunch or their hollow praise. I had Ben, Isabel, and a team that had believed in me when I was a nobody. And that was more than enough. 6 months later, Novagen Energy was a household name in Denver. Our office buzzed with the energy of new hires, and our panels were powering nearly half of the city's public buildings and a growing number of corporate campuses. I was 27, and I was no longer the kid sketching dreams on napkins. I had stopped answering the calls from my father, mother, and Sophia. Their texts, which started as polite inquiries and slowly became more desperate, went unread. Leo never reached out, which was no surprise. His pride was as vast as his ambition. After that final confrontation in the lobby, I realized I didn't need their validation or a dramatic final word. I simply blocked their numbers and moved on, my focus locked entirely on building the future I had envisioned. And my world, far from shrinking, grew richer and more vibrant without them. Ben was more than a business partner now. He was my rock, my closest friend, always ready with a terrible pun or a late-night brainstorming session over a whiteboard. We'd spend our evenings debating the ethics of new technologies, our laughter echoing through the quiet office long after everyone else had gone home. Isabel, our once intimidating investor, had become a trusted mentor, guiding me through the complex world of boardroom politics with her sharp, incisive advice. "You're tougher than most of the Fortune 500 CEOs I know," she told me once, a rare but genuine smile on her face. And then there was Dr. Evelyn Shaw, a brilliant fusion energy scientist I met at a tech conference. Her fierce passion for her work matched my own drive, and soon our casual coffee dates to talk shop turned into something deeper, something built on mutual respect and understanding. With her, I felt seen, not judged. But most importantly, I wanted to honor the one person who had believed in me from the very beginning, my grandfather, Arthur Vance. Using some of Novagen's first significant profits, I launched the Arthur Vance Innovators Grant, a $100,000 program designed to fund young innovators in the field of renewable energy. At the opening ceremony, I stood before a crowd of bright-eyed students, holding the tattered book Arthur had given me all those years ago. "This is for the dreamers," I said, my voice clear and steady, "for the ones who don't have a cheering section at home." Offstage, Evelyn squeezed my hand, and in the front row, Ben clapped the loudest, his grin wide and proud. The first recipient was a shy 18-year-old with a revolutionary prototype for a new kind of solar battery. She reminded me so much of myself. I knew Arthur would have been proud. Looking back, I could finally see the true cost of my family's arrogance. They had written me off as a failure, too caught up in their own narrow definitions of success to ever see the value in mine. Now, they were the ones on the outside looking in, their calls unanswered, their invitations ignored. I didn't gloat or feel a sense of vengeful satisfaction. I didn't need to. My life was full, with a thriving company, a true partner in Ben, a powerful mentor in Isabel, and a loving relationship with Evelyn. Their absence didn't leave a void. It created the space I needed for people who actually valued me to come into my life. The biggest lesson I learned wasn't about winning a contract or proving them wrong. It was about realizing that my worth was never dependent on their approval or anyone else's. I had spent so many years chasing their respect, but in the end, every rejection, every lonely night, every painful failure had taught me that I was already enough, all on my own. Novagen wasn't just a company. It was proof that my dreams had weight, that I could build something lasting and meaningful, not in spite of their absence, but because of it. My family lost me, not because I failed, but because they were incapable of seeing me, and that was their burden to carry, not mine. End of story.